To gain some understanding of human affairs is not an easy matter. In many ways, it's harder than the sciences. Mother Nature doesn't serve you the correct answers on a silver platter, but at least she doesn't go out of her way to set up barriers to understanding. In the case of human affairs, that's the norm. Any system of concentrated power is going to try to erect barriers which have to be dismantled. Doctrinal systems, propaganda, all the devices that follow very naturally just from the existence of concentrations of power, state or private. Sometimes there are eminent figures who are kind enough to offer some assistance as to how to deal with these problems. For example, the professor of the science of government at Harvard University, Samuel Huntington, who's a terrific source of quotes I found over the years, he wrote that the architects of power in the United States, and of course everywhere else, must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. And he illustrated the thesis by explaining the function of the so-called Soviet threat in U.S. foreign policy. He said, you may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it's the Soviet Union that you're fighting. That's what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and which is quite correct. And it is what we discover case by case as soon as you expose power to sunlight. But honesty like that is pretty rare. As the Soviet threat began to lose its effectiveness, it became necessary to resort to other misimpressions to sell military action. But the basic observations remain correct, and in fact they go far back in time up to this moment. One illustration of this general truism is that professions of benign intent by political leaders should be simply dismissed. They're near universal, they're predictable, they therefore carry no information. It's true of the worst monsters, Hitler, Stalin, Suharto, Saddam, and others. Very touching professions of benevolence and benign intent, but you pay no attention to them. So, for example, the foreign minister of Iran very recently declared that Iran is dedicated to the construction of democracy and in a fully sovereign Iraq. That may be taken seriously by state loyalists, but it's shrugged off as irrelevant by everyone else. And the same is true when Bush and Blair and Rice and Straw and the rest make the same pronouncements. In fact, it's a lot clearer in their case for reasons that it takes considerable effort to ignore, and a good education, I should add. But sometimes the reasons, which are obvious, are articulated, though rarely, for example, by the prominent Middle East specialist Augustus Richard Norton, who pointed out that as fantasies about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were unmasked, the Bush administration increasingly stressed the democratic transformation of Iraq, and scholars jumped on the democratization bandwagon. Or, to put it less politely, while they were orating impressively about their dedication to democracy, U.S. and British leaders were also announcing that they are among the most brazen liars in history, since they had driven their countries to war with a solemn pronouncement that there was a single question, as they stressed over and over: will Saddam abandon his weapons of mass destruction? but that's all disappeared deep into the memory hole, while the media and intellectuals and commentary and scholarship jump on the democratization bandwagon, just as Norton observed. At the liberal intellectual extreme, they hailed President Bush's, what they called his messianic vision, which proved that the invasion was the most noble war in history. Although there were critics. The critics said that yes, it was noble and generous, but perhaps it's beyond their means. The beneficiaries are culturally backward and they can't appreciate our magnificence and so on. It's pretty hard to find an exception to this in media and commentary. Norton's one of the few. And there is indeed some evidence to support the near universal consensus of Western intellectual opinion. In fact, there's one particle of evidence, namely our leaders declared that that was their intention, so therefore it must be true, as is true in sufficiently disciplined circles in Iran, I suppose, or perhaps when the dear leader issues pronouncements in North Korea. The declaration suffices to guarantee its truth. However, let's make the effort to depart from the near unanimous party line, and notice that includes the critics who agree that it's noble and generous but unfeasible. We then, if we depart from the party line, we find that Western leaders, like others, consistently issue fervent appeals for democracy and have been doing it forever. But we also find that they act very much in the way that Professor Huntington described in a moment of honesty, namely sell intervention by creating the misimpression that you're fighting for democracy, keep the domestic enemy, the population, in the dark. I'm not going to run through the record. It's quite revealing and pretty clear, and sometimes even acknowledged by the more serious scholar advocates of what's called democracy promotion. Well, let's nevertheless try to take the messianic vision seriously and have a look at the examples that are brought forth now by the doctrinal systems in the U.S. and Britain, with others tagging along, to demonstrate that the vision is real for the first time. Also, let's put aside the fact that internal pressures for democratization within the Arab world have been going on for years, and the U.S. and Britain have been deeply concerned about them for many, many decades and have been in the forefront of trying to prevent them, but we'll put that down the memory hole as well. Also put down the fact that Qatar had its first fairly free elections with universal suffrage in 1999, and even more so the fact that the Qatar-based television channel Al Jazeera has been a very powerful force for democratization and reform in the Arab world for some years now, which is why it is so despised by the tyrants who are backed by the United States and Britain, and also by Washington, which has exerted every effort to try to drive it out of existence. A couple of years ago, the Emir of Qatar visited Washington, where Colin Powell, official administration moderate, demanded that he do something to shut down Al Jazeera, which operates from there. And in return, he received a lecture on freedom of speech from the Emir at a Washington press conference, rather amusing press conference, which the press was polite enough to ignore. The U.S. Finally had to resort to bombing Al Jazeera installations, and recently they drove it out of Iraq to ensure that there would be free elections untroubled by independent media. But let's put all that aside as well and turn to the examples that are now brought forth in support of the sudden conversion to the messianic vision, which we're supposed to take seriously as properly educated people. Well, there are three examples that are offered, so let's look at those. One is Lebanon, second is Iraq, third is Israel-Palestine. Well, let's take Lebanon. The events of the past few weeks resulted from car bombing in Beirut, which killed Rafik Hariri, as you all know. Unless the CIA and MI6 were responsible for the bombing, the U.S. and Britain played no role in the upsurge in Lebanon. Actually, that's one of the conspiracy theories that's circulating in Beirut, that it was a CIA-British affair. Personally, I don't believe it, although one can imagine why the story would spread. For example, we might rescue from the memory hole the worst car bombing that ever took place in Beirut, not the Hariri bombing, but another one, a truck bomb outside a mosque, timed to go off when people were leaving the mosque so it could slaughter as many people as possible. Official figures are it killed about 80, wounded about 200, mostly women and girls leaving the mosque. That one, however, is out of history because it was traced to the CIA and Saudi intelligence with British help, so that doesn't enter the canon of terrorism by definition. It was aimed at a Muslim cleric who escaped, but putting the possibility of U.S.-British involvement in the bombing this time aside, as I do, it doesn't seem plausible, then we can dismiss Lebanon from the pantheon of examples of the messianic vision. Turn to Iraq, more interesting case. That's the proof of the authenticity of the sudden conversion is the elections in January. And they were, in my opinion, a real achievement, primarily an achievement, a triumph, in fact, of nonviolent resistance. The main success is that the U.S. and Britain were compelled, very reluctantly, to allow the elections to take place. And that is a triumph of nonviolent resistance, for which Ayatollah Sistani was kind of a symbol. The occupiers sought in every possible way to evade elections, but they were just compelled to back down step by step. The Pentagon had called for, its words, a sizable, prolonged U.S. troop presence there and a relatively weak Iraqi army as the best way to nurture democracy. Anyone who knows any history will understand that. It's insulting to Orwell to claim that it's right out of Orwell. That was actually Paul Wolfowitz, Wolfie as the president calls him. He's been dubbed the idealist in chief as the leader of the crusade for democracy, which is also reasonable. He has an incomparable record of hatred and contempt for democracy going back dozens of years, of which this statement is a mild example, but they're much more extreme ones, so he should naturally be called the idealist in chief. In this case, even the U.S. appointed interim leaders refused to accept Wolfie's conception of democracy, bowing to public opposition. And the New York Times pointed out that that's a serious problem. It could put the Americans in the position of negotiating an agreement, military agreement, with leaders that they did not appoint on such sensitive issues as when the use of force will be allowed and whether U.S. forces can remain there, and that won't work. The Bush administration officials said, I'm quoting them, that the U.S. planned the long-term military relationship with the emerging